I think you just recorded the cold open.
Welcome to a special sweet edition of the D3 Datacast. I'm Zach Snyder, joined by my co-host, Matt Snyder. Welcome to the second week of the tournament, Matthew.
I can't believe we are already here. We're getting deep into the tournament. It's a fun time of year. We had a lot of great games, Zach. I don't know if you watched some great games. I watched a lot of great games over the weekend. Fun matchups, fun time of year. Excited to talk about it with you.
Should we just jump in and talk about it, Matt? I did watch some games.
Oh, good. Good. Yeah, let's talk about them.
Let's just jump in, Matt. Let's just use the bracket as our guide here, starting in the what we would call the Hampton-Sydney quadrant, Matt, starting off with that upper pod there, hosted at Hampton-Sydney, Matt. First game there was Farmingdale State getting an 80-66 win over Stevens. And then in the nightcap of that pod, Hampton-Sydney with a 98-61 win over La Roche. Hampton-Sydney emerges from the first weekend into the Sweet 16 with a 72-51 win over Farmingdale State. Matt, we saw Hampton-Sydney entering the tournament as the top team overall. They certainly played like it. They absolutely cruised their way into the Sweet 16.
Yeah, you're right. We saw them as heavy favorites, and I think they played like it exactly as we expected. Not the toughest test for them, but they still got, a good game, especially against Farmingdale State second round. For me, the surprise of this pod was Farmingdale State. Not that they beat Stevens. I think you can see there on the screen, our computer had them as almost, not quite 60-40 favorites to win that game. But I was a little bit surprised how they controlled that game kind of from start to finish. Farmingdale State was really impressive there. And then, you just run into a juggernaut of Hampton-Sydney. Hampton-Sydney kind of had their way with the weekend, generally speaking there. So not surprised to see the Tigers advance.
Moving on to the Catholic pod, Matt. This was the first game to tip off on Friday. A lot of fun to see that first tournament game tip off. It was between Rowan and Carnegie Mellon. And really interesting game. Rowan seemed to have control, and then it seemed like Carnegie Mellon took it back, and then ultimately it was Rowan was the last one with control, and they got the 81-69 win. And then a really maybe surprisingly good one, Matt, in the nightcap there. Catholic beats Worcester State 75-72, but takes overtime to do it. And perhaps as a sign of things to come, looking a little vulnerable, Catholic dropped the second round game there with Rowan as the host. Rowan gets the 89-85 win to move on to the second weekend.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that Rowan-Carnegie Mellon game. Just a fascinating game of runs and swings. I think it was the first 7 minutes, Rowan had jumped out to a 12-point lead. Carnegie Mellon uses the middle of the game to absolutely swing that 10 points in their advantage, probably with about 10, 12 minutes to play in the game. And then Rowan goes on a run and wins that by 10. I think that's a 22-point swing that each team had in this game, kind of back and forth. That's a fascinating one. Rowan certainly looked great on the bookends of this game, a little bit rougher in the middle, but they prevailed. And then against Catholic on the Saturday night, I think Rowan did a really good job. I think we had a large crowd, a nice crowd on hand at Catholic. Rowan did a good job of kind of controlling. They weren't like dominating that game, but for, up at halftime and then into the second half, they had a good lead. I think they were able to keep the crowd under control a little bit, not get them rolling too much. And then, they ended up winning a battle. Catholic was able to cut that down to like 2 or 3 points, I think, at the end. But Rowan was able to maintain the lead. They played with composure, and Rowan looked strong coming out of that pod.
So as we broke down the bracket odds coming into the weekend, Matt, Catholic was the favorite in that pod to get onto the second round. Rowan was the second best odds at 34.2% there to move on to the Sweet 16. So a bit of an upset here. Of course, after the first round, once this turns into a head-to-head matchup between Catholic and Rowan, the odds, change a little bit because you don't have four teams potentially in the mix. It goes down to the two. Rowan over Catholic was one of the 5 biggest upsets in the second round as determined by win probability from the D3 Datacast computer. Rowan was given 37% odds to win that game, and they move on. All right, let's talk some Region 10. Always fun to talk Region 10, Matt. The pod at Cal Lutheran, where it was Claremont Mudd Scripps getting a 78-71 win over St. Thomas. And then one of the host upsets here, Matt, as Whitworth with the 78-73 overtime win over Cal Lu. We talked about that Rowan Carnegie Mellon game being the first one to tip off. It was Whitworth and Cal Lu, which was the last to tip off of the day. So that was a lot of fun. It felt like all eyes in the D3 world were on that game, as it was the only one still going on. Then it goes to overtime. Really one of the great games of the day. And Whitworth ultimately pulls off the upset to move on. Another great game then, resulting out of that on the neutral court with Cal Lu knocked out. Claremont Mudd Scripps gets the 69-67 win over Whitworth to move on to the Sweet 16.
Yeah, that Whitworth Cal Lu was definitely the last game, as you said, one of the great games of the night. I think it was Sullivan Menard hit the three-pointer with like 20 seconds left or something like that to tie. Whitworth was down by 3. They tied that game and then were able to prevail in overtime. All the more impressive with Whitworth because, Zach, I think I saw a tweet from you, probably through the D3 Datacast account, that they've been without star player JoJo Anderson, who was maybe the conference player of the year in the Northwest Conference. And that was an impressive win for Whitworth to come through at Cal Lu and get that win in overtime without him.
And looking at our bracket odds here, Matt, while it lists Cal Lu as a 65-35 favorite, that's actually, as the overall bracket odds are being done here, that's actually not factoring in home court advantage. So when you do that, that was actually more of like a 75-25 game. And so Whitworth knocking off Cal Lu, one of the biggest first round upsets.
Yeah, and then the second game, Claremont Mudd Scripps was able to kind of reel Whitworth in a little bit after Whitworth came out to an early lead, and then the Stags. It was a tight second half. The Stags, credit to the Stags, they were able to stay in front of Whitworth and get that win. Keep Tom Quarry's bold prediction alive. Remember back from our first episode of the season, he said I think Claremont Mudd Scripps to the Final Four.
I do remember that.
Here they are in the Sweet 16. So great fan of the show, Tom Quarry. His prediction is still alive there.
Still alive. And then our other Region 10 pod hosted at Trinity, Texas, in San Antonio. Matt, the first game of the day there, Nebraska Wesleyan moves on with a 58-41 win over Centenary. And then I don't know what it is about Region 10 hosts. Another huge upset here. Actually, the biggest first round upset, Matt. Texas Dallas knocks off host Trinity by a score of 67-63. Setting up a Nebraska Wesleyan UT Dallas second round game. Nebraska Wesleyan moving on to the second weekend with a 77-63 win there.
Yeah, you're right. Region 10 hosts upset Central, right? We just talked about Cal Lu losing in their opening game. Here's Trinity, Texas losing in their opening game. That was kind of a back and forth second half, I think, between Trinity and UT Dallas. Trinity had a 2-point lead with about 30 seconds to go, but a big three-pointer from UT Dallas put them ahead. The Comets were able to then hold on the last couple of seconds. And then, that sets up the UT Dallas versus Nebraska Wesleyan game, the second round. Nebraska Wesleyan was able to cruise through their first game and got the 14-point win over Texas Dallas to win. So I think that ended up being what we'll find out is the lone ARC winner came out of this Region 10 pod here with Nebraska Wesleyan.
And when you factor in the home court advantage, UT Dallas had just a 12% win probability from the D3 Datacast computer, making this the biggest first round upset we saw. Congrats to the Comets. Big time. All right, Matt, that wraps up the Hampton City quadrant. Going to the Widener quadrant, starting with the Widener Pod. Matt, Christopher Newport seems to be putting it together. Not the road we thought they would be taking, and not with really the group we thought they'd be taking. But here they are, 79-59 winners over Hobart. And capping off the night there at Widener, the Pride get a 101-70 win over Roger Williams. And then second round, Matt, the Captains, 70-65 over host Widener. There they are, the defending national champions, back in the Sweet 16.
Yeah, the Captains keep rolling another year, same old story. Kind of two commanding wins, as you mentioned there, for Widener and Christopher Newport in the opening round. The second game then was a different story. Christopher Newport did jump out to a little bit of a lead early. Widener didn't go away. The two teams kind of traded traded some leads, I think, toward the end. But Christopher Newport, the captains, credit to them, they were able to knock off Widener on the road, a true road game there. And you're right with Christopher Newport. Who knows? Do they finally have some roster certainty that they've been missing for most of the season? They know what their team is. They're coming together and gelling as a team. I think they remain a dangerous team going forward. Obviously, we just saw them come out of a Widener pod, Widener being one of those kind of top 4 overall seeds. So really, really interesting stuff out of Christopher Newport, and I think they remain a dangerous team going forward.
Matt, Christopher Newport, just a 21% chance to win, according to the D3 Datacast computer, the number 1 upset in the second round.
Wow.
There you go. All right, to Oswego, New York, Matt. The Oswego State Lakers played host to the first game between Williams and DeSales. Just an absolute blowout for the Eves, 77-51 over the Bulldogs. It was a little tighter for the hosts in the nightcap there, Matt. Oswego State gets the 74-63 win over Babson. And then in the second round, it's Williams, 79-77 over Oswego State in a great game. But credit the Eves. They emerge, at least according to the computer, as underdogs, and they go 2-0, are moving on to the Sweet 16.
Yeah, my 2 thoughts about this pod. First of all, with DeSales, a really kind of surprising performance. They just looked completely outmatched by Williams. We mentioned in the first quadrant, Stevens kind of really got outplayed by Farmingdale State. That's the 2 MAC Freedom entrants into the tournament, and just really neither of them particularly competitive in their games. That's kind of surprising from a 2-bid conference. Second of all, it wasn't in overtime, and we did see several overtime games this weekend, but this pod final sort of between Oswego State and Williams for me was maybe one of the games of the weekend. Probably factored into that was one of the games I was able to watch almost completely start to finish. Once a bunch of games start going on, I don't do that quite as much, but that game was great. It was tied right in the last final moments for Williams. It was Cole Prowett-Smith who got into the lane and makes a tough shot with just about 7 seconds left to put Williams up by 2. He had 27 points. He was fantastic. Oswego State was able to get the ball all the way down the court to, I think it was Jeremiah Sparks, who had kind of a quick last-second look at a three-pointer to maybe win the game, but that one couldn't go. A really great game between 2 teams, Williams and Oswego State. In hindsight, that's a matchup that could have happened in the Elite Eight. I'm not necessarily talking like seeding wise, but just total team quality and the way those 2 teams have been playing. That's a great matchup, and we did see a few of those around the country in the second round. But Williams and Oswego, 2 teams that who knows could have or could still go deep into the tournament.
The Keene State Pod, Matt, got started with a really great one between Eastern and TCNJ. Eastern with the 80-79 win. TCNJ had a possession there, trying to win it at the buzzer. Didn't ultimately really get a great look off. It doesn't go. Eastern moves on with the 80-79 win. Keene State, with an 82-76 win over Marymount. Not super impressive, but look at what they did the next night against Eastern. Keene State really put it all together. Blows out Eastern 109-85. So the Owls looking good moving on to the second weekend.
Yeah, and in that game against Eastern, Octavio Brito, 40 points. Jeff Hunter, another double-double. Keene State, great team, great individual performances. They're a team I'm excited to see how they play next week in that kind of Guilford sectional. Like you said, I think the Owls ended the weekend on almost as high of a note as anyone in the country here.
Yep, and Brito with 40 points in that second round game, Matt, stands out. But I mean, that was really a box score stuffing performance. I think he had, I was looking at it earlier, if I'm remembering correctly off the top of my head, like 9 rebounds, 4 assists, a block, a steal. Like he was doing it all. I think like 8 of 13 from 3. Just incredible performance from Brito. All right, Matt, down to Guilford. Penn State Harrisburg pulls off the upset in round 1 with a 72-67 win over Hood. Matt, we talked about Guilford's first round game against Barry being a sneaky tough one, but ultimately it's an 87-70 win for the Quakers. So they handle Barry, impressive there. And then turning around Guilford with the 76-59 win over Penn State Harrisburg. Guilford onto the Sweet 16.
Yeah, I think for Guilford, I think the box scores or the line scores look like they cruised to 2 easy victories, and in some ways they did. But that Barry game was tight. I think that was 2 points at halftime. I think it was maybe more like the last 10 minutes of the game. Guilford was just too much for Barry and just kind of snowballed a little bit. But yeah, I think that was maybe more the case. The second game was a huge lead. I think maybe 24 points for Guilford at halftime over Penn State Harrisburg. Harrisburg cut into that a little bit in the second half, but really it was never uncomfortable for Guilford. I think they cruised to the win there. So a really impressive performance for the Guilford Quakers coming out of the first weekend here.
Halfway through the bracket, Matt, let's go on to the Case Western Reserve quadrant. There at Case, we saw the first game between Hope and Anderson. Hope gets a 95-79 win after they really jumped on top of Anderson quickly, and Anderson just never really recovered. Case with a 66-51 win over Mary Baldwin in the first round. And then, Matt, Case Western Reserves onto the Sweet 16 thanks to a 97-79 win over Hope. It was a very close game, like one possession game at halftime, and then Case just really puts it together in the second half. Yeah,
you mentioned how Hope jumped out all over Anderson. They kind of did that right out of the gate against Case as well. I think they had an early 10-point leader, so I don't know exactly what it was, but Case is good. They reeled them all the way back, and I think it was Case with the 1 or 2 point lead at halftime. They had kind of completely erased the lead, and then Case just kind of rolled in the second half over Hope. So really impressive performance by Hope in the first game. Really competitive first half with Case. Ultimately, Case was too much as the Case Western Reserve advances out of the pod.
To Wisconsin and Platteville, Matt, Loris gets an 89-64 win over Gustavus Adolphus in the first round. The host Platteville gets an 89-52 win over Bethany Lutheran in a final score that is, one of the more shocking. Even with the favorite winning, but just by how much the favorite won there in that matchup is a little bit surprising. And then Platteville gets the 81-67 win over Loris to move on.
Yeah, I'm just going to make up an award and give it to Platteville right now, but that's the most dominating performance by a host award, I think, goes to UW Platteville. They got a little bit of a tough draw with Bethany Lutheran because I think they would have, quote unquote, gotten Gustavus Adolphus, but there was a rematch. Those two teams had played, so the committee flopped that to give them Bethany Lutheran, a team who had not played, but who I think was a little bit higher rated than Gustavus. So that was a game that had some people thinking like maybe upset potential here, but no, that game was not close. Platteville just dominated Bethany Lutheran, 89-52, I think you said was the final. Huge game. And then against Loris, we had called this out, I think, in our preview, a potential maybe like even second round matchup. And although this one wasn't a complete blowout, I think Platteville kind of controlled the first half, then controlled the second half. Never really was in danger too much of losing that game. By the end of the second half of the second half, the final 10 minutes or so was kind of just double digits the whole way. Really impressive stuff from UW Platteville. Like, they're one of these teams. I know everyone's playing well because they're all in the Sweet 16, but to me, like, UW Platteville is one of the teams that seems like they're just rolling right now. And if I had to, pick teams to get to Fort Wayne, like, they might be one of my picks right now from the Sweet 16 on.
Let's go to Trine, Matt, where things got started with a game between Coe and Wabash, 79-74 for Coe in overtime. Another, I think, one of 4 overtime games we got in the first round. And then later that night, Trine gets a 91-81 win over Fontbonne. Matt, Trine struggled with this one. I mean, 10-point game like this wasn't, some sort of backdoor cover or, a late run made it a little bit more respectable. This was tough, and Fontbonne out-rebounded Trine. And as someone who's seen Trine play quite a bit, that was not something I expected out of this matchup.
Yeah, I think we had 3 really good games in this pod. First off, that Wabash-Coe was like an overtime instant classic that Coe was able to pull out. And yeah, credit to Fontbonne. I think we usually see the SLIAC champ overmatched in their first round game, and they went toe-to-toe with Trine the whole game. It was really only the last couple of minutes. I think the game was tied late. It was only the last few minutes, I think, that Trine really kind of pulled away and solidified what ended up being that 10-point lead. But that was a surprising game. Credit to Fontbonne for really taking it to Trine on Trine's home court. They really made that a game and really made that a battle, and I think they impressed me just how they competed in that one. Saturday night, though, was also interesting. Trine and Coe I think Trine had a 17-point lead at halftime. And this was a game I wasn't able to be watching at the time. I just saw the big halftime lead, and it was almost one of those games that you just file aside and say, okay, I'll check what the final score is. And then with only like 2 or 3 minutes left to go, I realized that Co had tied the game. And actually, I think they took a 1-point lead. So that game became a flurry, a final few minutes of a battle there. But Trine was able to kind of ride the home court, ride the home crowd, control the last few minutes, and get the 5-point victory there. But a bunch of good games that we saw down there at Trine in Angola, Indiana.
One more pod in this quadrant, Matt, was at Wash U with the only upset. You look at this quadrant, you look at the slide there, not a lot of red boxes, right? This was a pretty, there were some great games, some great performances, but as far as the results, pretty chalk, except for Illinois College with a 59-57 win over Dubuque. Down 1, they get the buzzer beater. Matt, and there was some great, more like sideline shots. He's going around social media, and it wasn't until I saw that I realized just how much of just kind of a turn and chuck shot this was. Not to take anything away from it, but this was like, this wasn't like a great look. This was an answered prayer. Love to see it. Congratulations to the Blue Boys. This is how they got their first ever Division III tournament win.
Yeah, it was sort of like the ball was inbounded and they sort of had the defender in front of him. Didn't really have a lot of space, so he just turns and chucks. I don't even know if he saw where the hoop was or if he just threw it in the direction of the basket. Got it to go. Incredible moment for Illinois College, and the Blue Boys have to feel great for them. But this whole pod was just like a crazy weekend. Like we had that game.
Well, let's go through it, Matt. Just finish off the scores here. Yeah. Wash U in the second game that night. Wash U gets a 71-68 win over Wisconsin-Lutheran. That went to overtime. And then Wash U gets the 68-67 win over Illinois College the next night in the round 2, also in overtime. So Wash U here on after 2 overtime games makes their way into the Sweet 16. Matt, I don't know how much you got a chance to watch the final few minutes between Wash U and Wisconsin-Lutheran. But sometimes you see a tournament game, whether it be D1 March Madness or whatever, and it just feels like there's this vibe where it's like the underdog is playing a lot looser. The favorite, things, it's coming down to crunch time. It just feels like things are tightening. That's the feeling I got from this game. It seemed like Wisconsin-Lutheran was buzzing all around. It didn't necessarily always turn into buckets or like misses on the Wash U end, but just there seemed to be like this late game energy about it that was really compelling to watch.
Yeah, like a team playing with nothing to lose, right, on Wash U's home court. Overtime game. Really interesting how that one ended, too. I think Wash U got the 3-point lead, and then Wisconsin-Lutheran comes down the court to try to get the game to tie. They do this like out-of-bounds pass, get the ball all the way down the court, and then ultimately the clock expires before they can get a shot off. I think some of the sideline type camera shots of that game shows that maybe the clock started about a second or a second and a half early there, and maybe Wisconsin-Lutheran should have had more time. But yeah, just a really impressive game from Wisconsin-Lutheran, taking Wash U to overtime, nearly pulling that one out. And then the very next night, after defeating the Northern Athletics Conference champions in overtime, they get Illinois College, the Midwest Conference champions, in, and that one goes to overtime as well. I think Wash U kind of sealed that one on like a stolen inbounds play at the end of the game or something like that. But Wash U survives, advances to the Sweet 16. They've played a lot of good teams playing through the UAA, so once you get to this point, anything can happen. But they just have to be, the Bears just have to be like completely happy to escape the weekend with 2 overtime wins.
Classic survive and advance mentality, right? Yep. Doesn't matter how you get there, just get the win and move on. All right, one more quadrant here, Matt, the Randolph-Macon quadrant. The first pod there hosted at Randolph-Macon in Ashland, Virginia. St. Joseph got the day started with a 97-83 win over Geneva. And Randolph-Macon, as the top seed in this quadrant, cruising to a 77-45 win over Baruch. And Randolph-Macon is on to the Sweet 16 thanks to a 75-64 win over St. Joseph, Connecticut.
Yeah, St. Joseph, certainly no stranger to NCAA tournaments, but Geneva made that game, I think, pretty interesting early on. I think it was only like one possession at halftime or so, but then second half, the St. Joseph Blue Jays were just too much. They were able to overcome Geneva by 14 points there. Randolph-Macon, really no surprises against Baruch. They were able to really kind of roll kind of late in that one. But the second, the final game ended up being pretty interesting. Randolph-Macon gets the 11-point win over St. Joseph. But that one kind of got tight toward the end. I think it was about 2 possessions still, maybe 6 points with about 3 or 4 minutes to play. St. Joseph really couldn't get any closer than that. But that's kind of how things go when you play Randolph-Macon sometimes. Interesting to note that Randolph-Macon was still without Jabril Robinson. They had missed him for the ODAC tournament, still without him here. So we don't know. I don't personally know what his status is going to be in the future. So, the Blue Jack or the Yellow Jackets certainly miss him, but they've been winning. So here we go.
On they roll. Yep. All right, Matt, one of the stacked pods of the first round or opening weekend at John Carroll. Matt, Calvin gets a 93-78 win over Elmhurst. Matt, that was a Calvin season high for points. John Carroll gets an 85-81 win over SUNY New Paltz, setting up a second round matchup between Calvin and John Carroll. Matt, Calvin gets the 71-66 win. And the 66 points represent a season low in a game for John Carroll, Matt. So on one night, Calvin goes for a season high for their own point total. The second night, they hold their opponent to a season low point total. And on the nights, go to the Sweet 16.
Yeah, definitely a pod you and I were paying a lot of attention to, Zach. A wire-to-wire lead against Elmhurst in the opening game, jumped out to a big early lead. Elmhurst kind of fought back in the second half, but then in the late first half, the second half, Calvin really controlled there. That was Calvin's best three-point shooting night of the season, over I think 56% for Calvin on their three-point attempts. Really impressive game for SUNY New Paltz in the kind of the nightcap there against John Carroll. We saw them last week knock off Oswego State in the SUNYAC final. They almost had a similar type of vibe here against John Carroll. John Carroll had a double-digit lead, I think, at halftime, early second half, but New Paltz was able to cut that down into the single possessions. I think 2 points multiple times in the final couple minutes. They could never tie it or take the lead. John Carroll just had enough and was able to fend off SUNY New Paltz to set up that Calvin versus John Carroll Region 7 matchup on Saturday night. Calvin was able to jump out to a big lead and actually held a fairly substantial lead for most of the game. Let's see, that game, the lead was 15 points with 7.5 minutes to play. John Carroll was able to trim that all the way down to 3 with about 2:20. Things got a little tight for Calvin there. Ultimately, they were able to hit a couple nice shots, including a miracle banked in 3. They were able to hit just enough free throws down the stretch to secure the win there at John Carroll. Tough place to play, but Calvin moves on to the Sweet 16 to face Randolph-Macon.
Yeah, big time atmosphere and big time game between two Region 7 powers there. All right, moving on to Trinity, Connecticut, Matt, where Swarthmore jumped out quickly on top of Virginia Wesleyan, kind of held on a little bit more there to get the 67-59 win. Trinity, Connecticut was all over Utica in that first round game, 83-54 winners there. And then host Trinity, Connecticut beats Swarthmore 83-74, and they are moving on to the second weekend.
Yeah, that Saturday game between Swarthmore and Trinity in particular looked like it was going to be just kind of like maybe a big win for Trinity. Early second half, they were able to pull a double-digit lead, 14 points or so, but Swarthmore just kind of kept chipping away, 69-69 with just under 5 minutes to play. It was a tie game. Unfortunately for Swarthmore, they maybe spent everything and just pulling back from 14 to even it back up, and then the Bantams, Trinity, was able to kind of get things under control the last kind of 3-4 minutes of the game and pull out to that 9-point victory. But Swarthmore definitely made things interesting. I think impressive for me to watch them in this pod this weekend, the way they kind of really controlled Virginia Wesleyan from the jump and were able to hang on in that one, to how they're able to battle back against Trinity. But Trinity is really impressive. We've seen them highly rated by the computers, and now in the human polls, Trinity's, this is a stacked quadrant, I think, here as far as kind of top tier teams, as far as like the computer ratings and some of the top 25 voting, but Trinity looks almost as good as anyone right now.
Yeah, I believe it was 33 points for Vinny D'Angelo against Trinity there, but needed just a little bit more. Came up just short. All right, one more pod to talk about here, Matt, that was played at NYU. Tufts opened with a 59-55 win over Stockton. And then NYU ended up pulling away from Husson, 82-61, the win there. And a great one, a great NESCAC UAA matchup here, Matt, for the right to go on to the Sweet 16. Tufts gets the road win over NYU, 65-62.
Yeah, just checking back the box score, I wasn't able to watch much of the Husson NYU game, but I was kind of surprised to see, given the final score, that Husson actually had a 1-point lead with 11 minutes to go in that game. And then from there on out, they only scored 8 more points, allowed NYU to score 30 points. The final score looks very lopsided, but with, almost 10 minutes or so to go, that was anybody's game. So a very interesting game. Not surprising to see NYU win. I think we thought they were big favorites going in, but the way the game played out, I think, was a little bit interesting. That Tufts NYU final was just a few points most of the way, back and forth. I think they even traded the lead in the last couple of minutes. Tufts was able to hang on and set up that NESCAC matchup next weekend between Tufts and Trinity.
So speaking of next weekend, Matt, we got some great matchups in weekend one. We're on the schedule. We've got some more great matchups for the Sweet 16 here. Let's get into them, starting with that Hampton-Sydney quadrant. Matt, these games will be played at Hampton-Sydney. They get Rowan, and as they were in the first weekend, Matt, Hampton-Sydney will be a heavy favorite here. The computer likes them, gives them like 90% chance to beat Rowan here, favors them by 14. The other game there will be Claremont Mudd Scripps against Nebraska Wesleyan. This is kind of seen as like a 60-40 game there with in Nebraska Wesleyan's favor, and with a point spread of 3.5.
Yeah, just starting up at the top there, Hampton-Sydney, Rowan. A little bit of a game of contrasting styles here, Zach. You and I always like those games. Rowan's not crazy fast, and Hampton-Sydney's not like too crazy slow, but Hampton-Sydney does pace out at a more deliberate rate, and Rowan does like to get up and push a little bit if they can. So always interesting to see just how those games play out, if one team is able to adjust to the other or if one style wins out. Ultimately, I think we both expect Hampton-Sydney to win. They are rated very well across the board, offense and defense. But what Rowan, kind of a different look maybe than they're used to seeing in ODAC play, generally speaking, I think will be interesting there. I think I like these kind of more even-y type matchups of Claremont Mudd Scripps and Nebraska Wesleyan, kind of a 60-40 type anyone's game here. It'll be interesting to see what happens between the Stags and the Prairie Wolves.
Yeah, CMS and Nebraska Wesleyan end up looking very similar. Just the differentiating factor in Nebraska Wesleyan with a much better defensive rating there, and that's basically the entire difference. Very similar offensively. They play at very similar tempos. Not something that factors into your overall rating, but just kind of an interesting dynamic to look for. I mean, these are two teams that are going to want to play at the same pace. So we'll see if indeed Nebraska Wesleyan's defensive metrics can win out there.
And their defense is that 3-2 zone style defense. So it's always interesting to see, does that or does that not affect a team and how they play against them.
All right, Matt, our next group here, games that will be played at Guilford. We get a matchup between Christopher Newport and Williams, two teams we talked about earlier on in this episode, pulling off some upsets to be here. Now they meet in the Sweet 16, guaranteeing one of them to go on to play for a trip to the Final Four. The computer sees this as a really even one, slight edge to Williams, kind of a 52-48 type game in terms of win probability. If you're putting a point spread on it, maybe just a half point in Williams' favor.
Yeah, and two teams that have had their fair share of tournament success, right, over the years. Williams definitely has national championship banners. We saw Christopher Newport hang theirs last year. Lots of deep tournament runs between these two teams. Williams was in the Elite Eight or Sweet 16 round at the very least 2 years ago. Two noteworthy blue blood programs coming here in maybe the most even game of the weekend on a neutral court. Just definitely one to watch.
And then Keene State, Guilford, Matt. This is a big time Sweet 16 matchup. It feels like, you take these four teams and it feels like, the opponents are a little bit messed up, but you get midway through a tournament and sometimes that's what happens, just depending on what upsets happen and where in the bracket they take place. So Keene State will be playing what turns out to be a true road game in the Sweet 16 against Guilford. basically the computer sees that home court advantage as the difference,
Yeah.
3.5 points in Guilford's favor. If you want to put a win probability on it, we're talking like 62% in Guilford's favor, 38 for Keene State.
Yeah, without the home court advantage, if this was a neutral court game, it would have been about like a half a point or 1 point type of a game. Really even matchup. The computer definitely favors the home court advantage in this case. When you get down to the Sweet 16, right? Anytime you see two of the favorites that had advanced, you get the feeling like, oh man, this could have been a Final Four matchup or something like that. This Guilford Keene State game definitely has that type of feel for me. It's a matchup you could have seen any point in this tournament from here on out, just as the way the games fall. But when you get down to 16 teams that are really good, this is sometimes the matchups you have. Like, this one just very much has that vibe where if you go up above, like Claremont Mudd Scripps and Nebraska Wesleyan, two teams that were a little bit underdogs in their pod. They weren't the host. They weren't the favorites. Doesn't quite feel like that when you get two upsets. Keene State and Guilford very much does, but definitely on your list of must-watch games is Keene State and Guilford.
Next pod, Matt, where our four teams definitely are the favorites that advanced out of the opening weekend. Case Western Reserve will be playing Platteville first in a game. This sectional will be hosted at Trine, so this is a neutral court game between Case Western Reserve and Platteville. Matt, you talked about how well Platteville is playing. The computer likes them by 1.5. In terms of win probability, this is like a 55-45 game in Platteville's favor.
Yeah, and I expect whoever wins this game to be maybe a slight favorite coming up on the Saturday night, the Elite Eight game. If Trine wins their matchup, then they'll have the home court advantage. But I think Case and UW-Platteville are both playing really well. They're both a little bit higher rated by the computer. I think the interesting thing here in these matchups and for Case Western going forward is, at least by the computer, has never been super thrilled with their defense, right? So you always wonder, is that going to cause a problem with them? A team like Platteville definitely can put up points in bunches. They have some great offensive players on their team. Logan Pearson, I think, is one that we all think of first and foremost. Is a team like Platteville just going to be able to score on Case Western, or is Case Western able to clamp down and limit that? We know on the other side, Case can score in bunches as well. So is it going to be a game where they just have to outscore the opponent, or are they going to be able to defend enough to keep it close on that side of the ball as well?
Yeah, I love the point you made coming into the tournament that Case Western Reserve's profile in terms of their, the shape of their team and how it feeds into their overall adjusted efficiency margin is very similar to the Wabash team we saw a couple years ago, right? Where the defensive number is not great, right? We're talking like outside the top 200 even here. Mm-hmm. But that elite offensive number, like you can win with that kind of profile. We saw Wabash make a run to the Final Four before. Certainly Case Western Reserve, you figured if there was going to be a problem, like maybe that would have shown up against Hope. And maybe you want to say that's what happened in the first half, but look at what happened in that second half, and they ended up cruising. The Spartans, despite what looks like, comparatively to a lot of these other teams, a defensive deficiency, finding ways to get it done. And as history's shown, you can get it done that way.
Right.
All right. We mentioned Trine is the host here, Matt. They get Wash U in the Sweet 16. 4-point favorite. Of course, that home court advantage factoring in heavily there. The computer likes them in terms of win probability, 64% compared to 36% for Wash U.
Yeah, it'll be a very interesting matchup. I think a very even matchup. If you look up at these metrics across the board, defensively, they both rate very similar, about 91 points per 100 possessions that they give up. Offensively, Trine scores a little bit more, 110 points per 100 possessions to Wash U's 107, but they're both similarly shaped teams. They rely on their defensive abilities a little bit more than their offensive abilities, but they're competent. They're good at both sides of the ball. I think Trine has taken a big step forward offensively this season, and I think you're right. Ultimately, the home court could end up being a big factor here. That's going to favor Trine. They're the third seed in this three-team grouping, but the way the geography works out, getting Cleveland to St. Louis and Wisconsin, you can all get into the middle at the bustling metropolis of Angola, Indiana, and host it at the MTI Center. So advantage here for Trine, getting the home court advantage. See if that'll pay off against Wash U.
You think we can get an overtime game here, Matt? Make it 3 for 3 for Wash U in overtime?
Yeah, hope so.
All right, one more quadrant to talk about here, Matt. That's the Randolph-Macon quadrant, but this game will not take place at Randolph-Macon. Against geography in play here, Matt, with some of the travel restrictions and the 500-mile rule. Again, to our friends in Region 10, no, Region 10 teams are not the only deserving hosts who will miss out on hosting. We already talked about one with Case Western Reserve, having to play at Trine. Here, Randolph-Macon has to take a trip to Trinity, Connecticut for what will turn out to be a neutral court matchup with Calvin, Matt. The computer likes Randolph-Macon by 8.5 and gives the Yellow Jackets a 77% chance to move on to the sectional final.
Yeah, really fascinating matchup. I don't think we've ever seen Calvin versus Randolph-Macon in men's basketball before. So I think maybe the first time for these two programs, both nationally profiled teams, both have national championships in their history. The computers think Randolph-Macon is a favorite. They're the number 2 team by the efficiency ratings. Calvin checks in at number 14. Randolph-Macon seems to have an advantage across the board. It'll be interesting to see, though, what Calvin can counter with, what does Randolph-Macon do to neutralize Jalen Overway? Is Calvin able to continue their hot shooting that they've had so far in the tournament? The way things were set up, this sectional could have been at Randolph-Macon, except for now geography, as you mentioned. It's going to be at Trinity, Connecticut, making this game a neutral court game here first between Calvin and Randolph-Macon. So that is a little bit more in the Calvin Knights' favor than it would have been if it was down at Randolph-Macon. Tough place to play down there. But should be an interesting matchup here.
And then finally, host Trinity, Connecticut, Matt, in a NESCAC matchup here in the Sweet 16 with Tufts. Trinity took both regular season meetings, I believe, one in conference play, one in conference tournament over Tufts, and they are 11.5-point favorites here. The computer likes them 85% chance to move on to the sectional final.
Yeah, I think committee did some good work to separate some conference teams in certain places through the bracket. I think they were maybe unable to do that as much here to prevent maybe a Sweet 16 matchup. I think first of all, Tufts was not their pod favorite, so that was maybe one thing. But also with only so many places a team like Tufts can get, they couldn't go to Keene State because they probably played earlier in the year. So they Tufts ended up with NYU. Anyway, we get a conference Sweet 16 game. A game Trinity knows they can win. They've won twice. We'll see if that happens. I know people say it's hard to beat a team 3 times. Of course, that doesn't apply. Once you've already beaten them twice, you only have to beat the team one more time. And we've seen Trinity be able to do that. But of course, it would, I think, ultimately shock no one if Tufts was able to win. I think that they're an underdog by the computer and probably by the people who have observed the first 2 matchups. But still, NCAA tournament, anything can quite happen. But I'm just really impressed with the way Trinity is playing right now. I would not be surprised to see Trinity get through what remains a very tough quadrant and get into Fort Wayne still.
So that's what's going on here, Matt, in the Sweet 16 games coming Friday. Let's take a zoomed out look here, update our overall bracket odds. We talked about how overwhelming of a favorite Hampton-Sydney was coming into the tournament, both just in terms of their chances to reach the Final Four and as the overall tournament favorite here. And so not surprising to see them cruise into the Sweet 16 and maintain large advantages there, especially with some of the other upsets taking place. Hampton-Sydney looking like a strong favorite overall. We look at favorites to win, to make it to the Final Four here. We're looking at Hampton-Sydney out of that sectional. Basically, whoever wins between Keene State and Guilford. We talked about that game being a kind of a toss-up, maybe slight lean to Guilford with the home court advantage. But whoever wins that game is going to be the heavy favorite to win in that next round to move on to the Final Four. And then maybe a similar dynamic between Case Western Reserve and Platteville. Right now, the computer likes Platteville a little bit more. But even with the uncertainty of moving on, Case Western Reserve there with the second highest odds there to win in the Elite Eight and move on to the Final Four at 26.3 compared to 34.6% for UW Platteville. And then, a different dynamic in play there at Trinity, where Randolph-Macon and Trinity are both pretty big favorites in their Sweet 16 matchup. And then it's kind of a, more of a 50-50 game between Randolph-Macon and Trinity as to who is the favorite to go on to the Final Four.
Yeah, I think for me, it was interesting to see kind of what odds did or did not shift too much. A team like Hampton Sydney, we talked last week about them being still the favorites. Their odds have only increased, well, I say only, by about 3 percentage points. They were heavy favorites to come out of this weekend as it was. So they add a few percentage points to their championship odds, but nothing overly drastic. I think an interesting thing maybe for them is their chances to win the Elite Eight round were standing at 61% last week, now at 71%. So they're becoming heavier and heavier favorites to get to the Final Four at that point. I think other favorites were like Trinity, Connecticut. Their overall championship odds were just under 16% a week ago. They're now just over 18%, so another couple points. Randolph-Macon was sitting at 16%. They are now at 20%. So I think like 2 to 4 percentage points are what some of these heavy favorites are moving. Some of the more like underdoggy teams like Nebraska Wesleyan, you see them now sitting at 1.4% overall championship odds. And what were they last week? 0.5%. So they've maybe tripled their odds. I think that's similar to a team like Calvin, now having championship odds of about 1%. They were at 0.3%, so tripling their odds for some of these underseeded teams. I think upsets are still bound to happen. I think if one of these kind of top dogs like a Hampton Sydney or a Trinity Connecticut were to go down, I think we're going to start seeing some odds shift more rapidly here, going from the Sweet 16 to the Elite Eight.
All right. It's time, Matt, to put a little skin in the game. Move on to our picks.
All right, Zach, here's our rundown of how we did last week in our 5 games. We had both picked Carnegie Mellon over Rowan. Rowan was a 6-point favorite by the computer. We thought that line was too big, but they won by 12, so we both missed that pick. Zach, you had picked Swarthmore. I had picked Virginia Wesleyan in what was a half-point line, but the Garnet really controlled that game, won by 8. You get that pick. I picked Co. They were 4-point favorites. This was an overtime game, and they win by 5. So I kind of backdoor my way into a win there. You had Wabash, so I get the point. St. Thomas versus Claremont Mudd Scripps was a pick'em. We had both taken Claremont Mudd Scripps. They end up winning by 7 to cover that computer line. We both get the point. And then our D3 Datacast game of the week was DeSales against Williams. It was a 3.5-point line in favor of DeSales, Zach, but this was a 26-point win for Williams. We both correctly picked that Williams would cover that spread, and they won easily outright. So let's check out the scoreboard. They easily won the game. We were both 3-2 last week, so you maintain your 3-game lead at 49-35-1 overall. I am 46-38-1. I am running out of time to catch up. So let's get to this week's pick slate. Here are the games on the screen. I will read them for our podcast-only friends. Game number 1 is Nebraska Wesleyan, 3.5-point favorites, neutral court versus Claremont Mudd Scripps. Our second game is Christopher Newport, half-point underdogs versus Williams. Our third game is Case Western Reserve, 1.5-point underdogs versus UW-Platteville. Our fourth game is Wash U, 4-point underdogs at Trine. And then our D3 Datacast game of the week in the Sweet 16 is Keene State, 3.5-point underdogs at Guilford. So let's go back and make our picks, Zach. The 3.5-point line between Nebraska Wesleyan and Claremont Mudd Scripps. Who do you like?
I like to take the points here with Claremont Mudd Scripps, Matt. We talked about last week being interested to see how the American Rivers Conference teams do, 4 teams in, but we felt like with all 4 entrants there wasn't a lot in the non-conference schedule to point to in terms of just overall superiority. All their quote-unquote big wins of the season were amongst themselves, it seemed. And I'm not feeling super great about the American Rivers coming out of the first weekend. You're giving me points here. I will take them.
Zach, I'm thinking very similar to you. I'm going to take the 3.5 with Claremont Mudd Scripps. I think they had, Nebraska Wesleyan had a great first weekend, but I think Claremont Mudd Scripps ended up playing tougher competition in their games against St. Thomas and Whitworth. They were able to win both of those games. The way the bracket ended up for Nebraska Wesleyan, pretty favorable, right? No shots or anything, but they had 2 games that were maybe easier than they bargained for there. So for that reason, I'm going to go Claremont Mudd Scripps getting the 3 points. Second game between Christopher Newport and Williams with a half-point line. What do you like?
I will go with Williams, Matt. Basically a pick 'em here. I'm really impressed. impressive first weekends for both teams, really. But I think I like Williams a little bit more in terms of their ability to keep it going.
Yeah, I think last week one of my picks was Williams to the Elite Eight. I think I said that out loud on the podcast. I'll have to go back and look. But I'm actually going to change my pick here, even though it's just a half-point line. I'm going to go with Christopher Newport. I think their game against Widener really impressed me. I think Christopher Newport maybe is starting to gel. Maybe they're starting to find. We know they were kind of high and low during the season, but maybe now they're finding a little bit more consistency. So I think I like their chances against Williams. Only a half-point line. I guess I'm picking them straight up to win, but I will take the Captains there. The next one, we will go out to Trine for 2 games. The first one here, though, is Case Western Reserve, 1.5-point underdogs versus Platteville. Zach.
Yeah, I know we've talked about this just in terms of the profile of Case Western Reserve. Obviously a gifted offensive team. And, Platteville's got some guys who can really score too. Maybe you get a little bit more defense. I'll go with the Pioneers here.
All right, you're taking Platteville, Zach. I will also take Platteville. I think of this quadrant right now, I think they're playing the best. I think that they enter feeling high, riding a lot of confidence. I think in a matchup like this, in an arena that Platteville has already played in this season, they had a big win over Calvin there, and they had a loss, but a tight game to Trine. I think Platteville will feel good playing at the MTI Center and get the win by 2 or more. All right, we're staying at Trine. We're going to go Wash U 4-point underdogs at Trine. Zach, who do you like?
I will lay the 4 points here, Matt, with the Trine Thunder. Survive and advance, never apologize for a win in the tournament. That being said, I think there's a little bit of element of lucky to be here for Wash U. Maybe that's overstating it, but, let's be honest, they didn't have the toughest run to get here compared to some of the other teams we've talked about in this episode. Overtime games, they were in coin flip situations and it came up their side both times. Eventually that's got to run out. I'll go with the Trine Thunder.
All right, I'll go against you. I will take the 4 points in my favor. I think the defenses are going to win out. I think this might have a chance to be some low possession games. I think the score might be low. I think the margin's going to be close. We know Wash U always just tries to get the game into overtime, so I think it's going to be close. I think the Bears stay within 4 points, have a chance to win it, but either way, within 2 possessions here, and I think the Bears cover. All right, our game of the week, Keene State, 3.5-point dogs at Guilford. Your pick.
I'm going to take the points here, Matt, with Keene State. Really interesting to see Keene State get to go up against an ODAC opponent. You play an ODAC, things like rebounding are super important. Well, Jeff Hunter is a monster rebounder. I like him being able to go in there. We talked about the 3.5 basically being the home court advantage for Guilford. So, just kind of in a true talent team for team, it's pretty even. I'll take the points.
Yeah, I'm going to go with you, Zach. I think both of these teams were impressive in the first weekend. Probably these two, along with UW-Platteville. But I was really impressed. We're coming off that high of the big win over Eastern for Keene State, so I'm going to go right back with the Owls. Especially if you're going to give me the 3.5 points. I like this game to at least be close. So I think Keene State can cover that. And I like what you said. Some of those key players that they have. Jeff Hunter, I think he could be like an ODAC style player. I think Octavio Brito definitely can score. We'll go with the Owls here to at least cover. That's the picks.
We're sure to be wrong on all of them.
All right, moving on. We got a mailbag?
Right. We have a mailbag, Matt. It turns out there's some things to talk about this week. All right, we're going to start off with one here from Joe, Matt. Joe left this as a comment on D3Datacast.com on our blog post for the previous episode. Joe asks, with all the angst on RROs, selections, etc., is it time to consider some play-in games a la D1?
Yeah, so play-in games, make the 64-team tournament maybe a 68-team tournament, get 4 more additional at-large bids. I think the challenge in D3 is always money, right? NCAA pays for the travel, the expenses for the tournament. Adding more teams is potential for more hotels, more flights, etc. So I think that'd be a big budgetary issue with how tight the purse strings tend to be in Division III. That being said, I know there was some conversation about maybe expanding Pool C at large access. I think that's not going anywhere for the time being. So it'll be interesting. I think if I had to guess, I think we're locked in at 64 for the foreseeable future. I don't see us expanding past that anytime soon.
Yeah, and with expansion comes you have to figure out how that's going to work with the schedule.
Yeah.
And Matt, I know if we kind of take some of the talk that's been happening with like the expansion of the football playoff, I think everyone agrees that there needs to be some sort of expansion to the Division III football playoff. The problem is, how do you do that? You'd have to like add a weekend or add a week to be able to add a round, and that shifts the whole calendar. So there's a lot of things to get worked out. Now, we've taken on episodes, looking at fixing the criteria. So I want to be in a mindset of looking for reasons why we can't do something. I prefer to always come at it like, well, what can we do or what makes sense? Um, but and that's why I mentioned I think there's scheduling
Yeah.
concerns that come up here. You could say you try to fit in like
A Wednesday.
a Wednesday or let's say the bracket comes out, you get it out by Sunday so that you can play Tuesday. Like this is
Yeah.
um pretty quick turnarounds, and we talk about Division III being like the most pure or maybe the only remaining pure like balance between student and athlete, right? There's no scholarship, there's not scholarship level. These Everyone is there to go to school, but they're also playing a sport. And so I just wonder how that would all work in terms of trying to get in another round. Here's the thing, Matt. I think if we did see some sort of expansion, it would bring about or necessitate a step backwards, I think, in terms of the national feel that we are able to get,
Yeah.
or to the extent we're able to get. I think we would go back to a lot more of a regional system.
Yeah.
And if you look at the way that the Division II bracket is set up, it is strictly you play your region and one team comes out of it. One team ends up coming out of every region. And I don't like that, right? We've seen years where, Hope and Calvin meet 4 times and then they get bracketed for a second round game and they have to play a fifth time. It's like,
Yeah.
we've seen them enough, right?
Right.
I like the system here where we can have Randolph-Macon and Hampton-Sydney on opposite ends, and if they're both good enough to get all the way to the final, so be it, and they won't meet until the final. I like that we have as much of a national feel. Obviously, there's limitations. I like that. But Matt, if you would allow me to get a little bit crazy, there's one thought I did have that would be kind of interesting, I think. Let's say we were able to add 4 play-in games. I'm just thinking back to like, we currently have 10 regions, but previous to region expansion, we had 8. And I'm envisioning kind of a cool world where we are able to expand the playoff or the bracket a little bit, like in that 8-region world. You just take everyone who's left on the table and they are your play-in games. And then, you probably have to match people up regionally or what makes sense in order to minimize travel. But I thought of that as kind of a fun way, maybe if we ever did get to a point where there were some additional play-in games, that you just take everyone who was left at the table, they're your play-in opponents, and bracket from there.
So you pick, let's say you're back in that 8-region world. You pick, this year would have been 22 pool C's, but you pick 18, and then instead of picking 4, you take the rest of the 8, and then you pair up like region 8 and 9 together, and their 2 teams play, and then you pair up region 7, and you figure out the geography, whether that's 7 and 3 or whatever, and you pair those teams up, and you have a plan. It would have to be regional. I agree with you in the step back from that direction, but I just think it's probably not going to happen anytime soon.
Well, and you talk about schools closing and the impact, right? Like we're seeing some consolidation. So I think we've already seen the number of pool C's go up over the last couple of years, right? We've seen some conferences have to merge because schools have been closing, and whether they're merging just to stay together or to try to maintain some viability. I think we're still living in that world, and there may be further movement in that direction. So we'll see what happens.
All right. Next mailbag.
Next one. Matt, this comes from Maria on Twitter. Do you have any intel on how the officials are chosen for the tournament? Are they typically from different regions, or is it more of whoever is available?
So Jim Haney is the national coordinator of officials, and I think he does all the tournament assignments, or has a heavy hand in those tournament assignments. And I believe that they are crews that work in different leagues. So like even up to the Final Four, we saw that last year there was like a team, a officiating team from the Northwest Conference that did a game. One that was was there a CCIW crew there one night as well, and I think a Skyline Conference crew that
I think it was a CCIW and a Skyline in the semifinal games, and I believe it was the Northwest Conference crew that did the championship game.
They don't take individual officials from all over and mix up. I think maybe there's some small cross regional for these like opening round games. I don't know that like an MIAA crew is going to work the pod at Trine. I'm not sure. But they maybe will mix like a crew from Ohio or Indiana. Not exactly sure how that works, but I know it's all done at more of the national level, assigning tournament crews. And the goal is to help reward officials and crews that have done a good job throughout the season based on their evaluation process.
So the good news there is it should be crews and officials who have earned their way there, just like the teams have earned their way there, and not just, hey, whoever's available, we got this game that you need to officiate. No, it's done very systematically. I know during the season, Jim Haney, as the coordinator of officials, is working very closely with the people who are the assigners for the leagues, getting feedback, providing feedback. So to get to this point, and like you said, I believe he is the one or overseeing the assigning of officials to tournament games. All right.
Next one
from D3 Hoops Fan. I have a few questions. Matt, we got a triple here. Which team and player has been the most impressive to you through the first weekend? Let's just tackle that one, and then we'll go one by one here.
For me, it's always tough to get down to like the individual player level because there's so many games and so many teams from all around the country, and I'm just kind of one person watching them. Just from the stat line, like we already talked about Octavio Brito multiple times throughout this. I think he had an impressive game there as well. I'll just throw out his name. I think he was great in that game against Eastern, I think it was, for Keene State.
Yeah, he had 22-point effort in round one, and then that 40-point game we talked about in round two. He was one that stood out. But yeah, like you said, like it's really cool to get these staggered start times. But I feel like I'm just kind of getting a sampling of each game and not getting a feel necessarily of always the overall game flow, unless it's a game I'm really able to dive into, or even who, like on an individual level, is standing out. But Brito was certainly one. Impressive teams, Matt. I think when you look at the paths that all the teams took to the Sweet 16, the two that stand out are Calvin having to beat Elmhurst and then winning the true road game at John Carroll, and then Williams beating DeSales, and then another true road game there at Oswego State. I think those are the two by far like most impressive two wins to get to this point. So I think maybe those are the two teams to point out for me.
Yeah, they're the only two teams that had ranked
we talked
games.
About right. But, I mean, do you take anything away from Hampton-Sydney? You enter as the top-ranked team, like you're not going to be having to play the types of games like that, right? Yeah. So, I mean, I think they're impressive just in terms of how they were able to pretty much dominate. They're entered as the top overall seed and really did not put that in doubt whatsoever. All right, what game was the most exciting for you to watch?
Let's take this with the next one as well, though.
Okay. And then number 3, what second weekend matchup are you looking forward to seeing most?
Yeah, so go ahead.
Okay, I thought you had an answer that was going to like combine the two. So anyway, for the most exciting to watch, man, I was really getting into the end of that Cal Lu Whitworth game.
Okay.
Right? Just some big shots going to overtime. It wasn't one of these neutral court first round games, right? So you have like the crowd element, you've got the it was a great environment there at Cal Lu. That was a lot of fun.
So for me, my first one would be Oswego State and Williams. It was one I was able to put up on the TV in the living room. Oswego State does a good job with their broadcast on YouTube, so that's really easy to throw up on your Fire TV or your Roku or whatever. I like that Williams had a little bit of a lead. Oswego came all the way back and tied it. They were back and forth a little bit, and then just that ending for Williams, I think that was an exciting game. We also had a bunch of overtime games, but this one in regulation also was one of the most exciting for me. Second weekend matchups, we talked about it a little bit this episode as well. Outside of the Calvin games, which I think are just different for me on so many other levels, just another national game. Guilford and Keene State for me, definitely my top one to watch.
Yeah, Guilford, Keene State is the one that stands out to me as well. Yeah, you know what? I'm just going to stand on that. I'm not even going to throw out an alternative. I'm just going to say same goes for me double.
It's a good one. That's why we made it game of the week.
That's right.
All right.
Okay, Matt, one more here from Hoops Pop 12 on Twitter. Would love to know what you think the NJAC will look like next year now that 2 of 3 teams have been eliminated from the tourney. Forget about the rest of the tournament, Matt. We're looking forward to next year.
I'll admit that I don't know the particular dynamic of the NJAC rosters, or at least at this point. At some point during the offseason, I kind of start to look at some of that stuff to prepare for next year's preseason top 25 ballot. I'm not there yet, but what I know about the NJAC is you're probably going to have 3 or 4 really good teams at the top. It's probably going to include, again, I don't know the rosters and returning, but Stockton and Rowan are usually almost always good. I really liked what TCNJ was doing at the end of the season here. It's always going to be a good league. It hasn't been quite like the top tier league, but it's been like a second or third tier league, a good league, kind of around or above where our league is. The MIAA has been the NJAC, so it's going to be a good league. I just don't know what the dynamic's going to be quite yet, so I apologize for that.
Always seems to be a league that's sort of like in the top 10 conference discussion, depending on the year. Maybe that's a little bit above the line. I think that, the last couple of years have been a little bit above that top 10 line, maybe a little bit below. Always going to be good. Matt, it just seems like for whatever reason, in terms of the NCAA resume selection criteria stuff, those teams at the top of the NJAC always look
good numbers,
pretty good.
Yeah.
So it just seems like one of those leagues that you always have to have some sort of expectation that they're going to send 2 or 3 teams to the tournament. I think there's, Rowan has been pretty consistent at the top there, Stockton in the mix. And then after that, it seems like you can count on someone. It's just a matter of, is it going to be this year it was TCNJ? Is it going to be Montclair? Is it going to be Kane? Who's going to emerge maybe as that second tier that also is there to challenge for an NCAA tournament spot?
We've got Rowan still alive. I would love to see one of these NJACs make just a really deep tournament run one year. So maybe that's Rowan this year.
Maybe so. All right, that concludes the mailbag. If you have something you want us to address at the end of next episode, leave it as a comment here on YouTube. You can leave it as a comment on our site. Find us on social media at D3 Datacast on Twitter, Facebook.com/D3 Datacast. Lots of ways to get a hold of us. We're not hard to find. Let us know. And Matt, that brings us to the end of this episode, except for one very important thing, the most important thing, saying thank you to our great Patreon supporters, patreon.com/D3 Datacast. Matt, these people have gone above and beyond to support us, support our show, what we do here with the show, with D3Datacast.com, all the efficiency ratings, all the, tracking all the SOS numbers, everything during the course of the year. These people have taken it upon themselves as sort of a voluntary subscription, and we thank them. Matt, we have a couple new members here that have joined at the Great Job Team tier, so they get shout out to D3 Direct and Gina Feeks. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much to these folks. Thank you for helping to participate with us in creating these episodes, but also making D3Datacast.com ad-free. I know we just spent a whole big year of doing all the data. That's been fun to do. It's been fun to post to that there, so I hope everyone finds that enjoyable. If you'd like to support us on Patreon as well, join the team at patreon.com/D3Datacast. We have fun talking about the level, celebrating Division III basketball, tournament time, Sweet 16. We're right down to it. Zach, great job in this episode, and everyone out there, great job, team.
Good job, team.